Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Welcome to Medieval Church History. I'm Teresa Holman, and with me is Father Michael Witt. Welcome, Father.
Thank you, Teresa.
We are in show number 35.
We are.
And as you just told me before the show, we have probably about 8 more shows before the end of this medieval history program.
Right.
Gosh, that's fast.
Yeah. Well, we're coming up on that last century. You know, we'll be talking about things happening in the great 13th century, and then basically we take up with the early modern history and the other 80 programs that we had done with the death of St. Thomas Aquinas in 1274.
Mm-hmm.
So,
right.
Yeah. So we're still looking at some really incredible things. We're looking at the explosion of learning. We'll be taking a look at that, and then how eventually St. Thomas is going to take all that learning, pull it all together into the Summa. So we'll do sort of a summary of the Summa ourselves. And
that could be a challenge.
Yes, that as well. And then after that, we want to look at one of the other great things that comes out of this century, and that is the tremendous Gothic cathedrals.
Oh.
And how that came about, why that came about, and what are those things doing there. And then we're going to look at some really tragic history. We're going to look at the 100 Years' War and how that takes medieval civilization and just rips the heart out of it. We're going to look at the bubonic plague and the death of almost a third of the population of Europe, and how that also just destroys this wonderful medieval civilization that we've been watching take hundreds of years to come about. Mm-hmm. And then go into the destruction that it does, and then at the very end take a little assessment as to what all this means. What does it mean to have been medieval Europe, and what does that civilization give to us today? And are we, in fact, taking the legacy of that civilization, or are we, in our modern day, 21st century, rejecting it? And what's the cost if we dare reject it? So that's what we want to end up with. And like you say, we've got about 8 more programs to go.
Wow. And as I always say at the end of the programs, we're going to have to write something, because I can't have you not be here every week. I really enjoy these programs so much, and just the history that you teach us. It's so much fun.
Yeah, I've had a blast. Well, let's just jump in. Between 1150 and 1250, over about a 100-year period, there is an absolute explosion of learning. Is one of the greatest in all of history. The only other time I can think of is our own present time in the 20th century. Huge explosion of learning. I remember years back, a former student of mine, we're very good friends. When he was in high school, he read the entire encyclopedia from beginning to end. That was his nightly reading before he went to bed. That's something.
That is amazing. You don't find too many high school students willing to do that.
But he had a brother, a younger brother, who did the very same thing, but he did it on discs, on a computer. Isn't that something?
Yes.
So in less than a generation, within the same family, the oldest of the family to the youngest of the family, one read books cover to cover, and the other did the same thing on a computer. So huge amounts of knowledge. I mean, anyone who's ever gotten onto the computer and just done Google searches or whatever, or even with our own program going to the internet, we have all of these programs that we're doing archived and at that website. And that website is linked in so many ways to Catholic Encyclopedia, and hopefully down the line we'll get some webmasters in there and link up to some other good sites, the Vatican website and some of the other sites. But what a tremendous opportunity that we have, this wonderful gift of knowledge.
Fantastic. And it almost makes some of those books like encyclopedias just obsolete, because they need to be added to so often that technology makes it so much more appropriate to put it on disc or on online, whereas with a book you keep having to republish, it's just so much easier to do that.
You do,
with
but
the internet program.
call me old-fashioned.
I agree. I like having that book.
I do too.
I do.
Yeah.
But it just that encyclopedias seem to me like they aren't going to be as available as they were when I was, growing up. When I was in school, you went to encyclopedia for everything.
Yeah, that's right.
And you may still do that, but I would assume most people use that benefit through the computer rather than through a book.
Yeah, I think that's true. Well, there are 4 sources of this new knowledge that comes into Europe, and that in itself is very fascinating. First of all, the first source is through Syria, and right after the First Crusade, right after the First Crusade and the establishment of the Latin kingdoms in the East, there are a few scholars who moved there right away because they knew that there was a treasure trove to be had. But the key, in order to get to that treasure, was to learn Arabic. They had to learn Arabic. And so they moved to Antioch, to the city of Antioch, and learned Arabic and then began translating works that had never been seen in Western Europe, at least not since the fall of the Roman Empire. And one of those was a man by the name of Stephen of Antioch. And his specialty, he moves to Antioch in 1114, and his specialty is in medical textbooks. So these are Arab medical textbooks that the Arabs either wrote themselves or they got from the Greeks that they had translated from Greek to Arabic. But that's what he emphasizes. That's what he's translating and writing, and then this becomes available back over in Europe. Remember that some of the schools are just beginning to get started, these universities, and they're looking for textbooks. They're looking for new knowledge. Well, here's knowledge now available. But there's not a big market for medical textbooks. On the other hand, there's another fellow that arrives. His name is Philip of Tripoli.
Okay.
And he right away went for the bazaar. And so after he learns Arabic, he starts looking around for esoterica, and particularly stuff that has been claimed to be written by Aristotle. Whether it was or not, it probably wasn't. But one in particular, there was a book that he translated into Latin, the Secretum Secretorum, the Secret of Secrets. And this book is advice on how a would-be ruler should rule his life and his country. Now, supposedly, this was written by Aristotle for Alexander the Great.
Okay.
But, of course, there's no evidence of that at all. And actually what it is a lot of very secret advice and occult stories.
Okay. Is this what Friedrich II was looking for?
Maybe so. Yeah. Oh, I don't know. That's a good point. It might have been. It becomes wildly popular as a book. In fact, there are over 200 manuscripts of the Secretum Secretorium that have been. Remember, they have to be hand copied. Yeah. And this, consider that one of the most revolutionary books in all of the late Middle Ages was the Defensor Paces, which was written to attack the papacy. And to this date, all we know is that there were 4 and maybe 5 copies in the entire, all of Europe. So
there's 200
there are
of
over
this
200 of these.
Wow.
So this is a bestseller.
I would say.
And keep in mind that a book, first of all, if you could read it all.
That's a lot of writing.
Yeah, but a book would be worth a lot of money. You're talking about at least what it would cost to buy a brand new automobile today. And so you can invest in that. Well, it just goes to show you the tastes of Europeans at the time. It was pretty pedestrian. Well, that's one source of this new knowledge. The second source was from Constantinople itself. Now here, as we had talked about after the Fourth Crusade, there were a lot of Venetians who moved into that area and took over concession ports. And also, if you weren't going to be with the the Venetians, you might be with the Pisans.
Okay.
Others came from Pisa to do the same thing. And here, they come across these books, and again, you begin getting translators who then begin translating these books, and then copies are made. One of those is James of Venice. And after he learns his Greek and his mainly Greek, what he's going to do is he's going to zero in on Aristotle's actual writings, and especially, as you can imagine, now that we've studied about the trivium, especially logic. And so he takes Aristotle's book, Logic, and translates it, and it becomes a very important textbook in Europe. Another man from Pisa, his name is Burgundio of Pisa, and he zeroes in on the works of the Eastern Fathers. So he's going to translate into Latin the works of St. John Chrysostom, St. Basil, St. John Damascene. Now, surprisingly, the Western world had not heard these words in centuries and centuries, and now the great works of these early church fathers from the East now become available to the to scholars in the West. Another source of learning is going to come from Sicily, and here, after, you remember those darn Normans?
Yeah.
Well, after they arrived and after their conquest, they found themselves with 4 different languages and cultures all living on the same island. You've got Latins, you've got Greeks, you've got Arabic, and you've got Hebrew. And what they do is, and this is none other than Roger II, he makes the island a giant language school where you could study any of those languages. And this becomes another great opportunity to come in contact with other learning that had been lost. If you could only read Latin, and even that was a rarefied opportunity, in medieval Europe. But if you could only read Latin, so much else was denied you. Now, you have translators who are doing these translations from the Hebrew, from the Arabic, from the Greek, so that Latin readers were going to be able to understand and learn all of this new knowledge. Now, the fourth source, so as we're going across the Mediterranean, from Syria, Constantinople, Sicily, and the fourth source is Spain.
Oh, okay.
And what happens here is, again, a confluence of 3 major cultures. You've got the Goths who had conquered, but then you have the Arabs who had conquered the conquerors. And then you also have the Jewish communities that survive everybody. And so all of those 3 are living side by side. And when we talk about the Reconquista, we think in terms of lots of battles and that sort of thing. But in actuality, the vast majority of this time is spent pretty much in peace with each other, living side by side. By the early 11th century, the power and the strength of Arab Spain is waning. And by 1034, the caliphate at Cordova has disintegrated. So there's no longer that military power. There's no longer the sword to enforce control. And by 1085, the city of Toledo falls to the Christians. And when that happened, the bishops of Spain immediately went there, and they used their episcopal authority to preserve learning in Toledo. Now, don't we always have this picture of, the Christians coming in and burning all the books and all that? Quite the opposite. Here you have the bishops themselves going to Toledo and then preserving the works of the Arabs and of the Jews in order to make sure that learning would be preserved and could be used. And of course, you're going to have translations coming out of that. there were others who were interested too. Remember Gerbert of Aurillac, the future Pope Sylvester II, goes to Spain in order to learn what he can also. And then after 1100, there are more and more that are doing the same thing. The new bishop of Toledo is Bishop Raymond, and he sets up a translation school in order to translate the works in Hebrew and the works in Arabic into Latin. One of those that he attracts as a translator is sort of like the superstar of the age. His name is Adalbert of Bath. Now, this man is so European, it's not even funny. I mean, first of all, Adalbert is a German name, but he's from Bath, which is an English city. He spent most of his adult life in Sicily, in Syria, in the Latin kingdoms. So he's fluent in these languages. And then, as I say, Bishop Raymond of Toledo attracts him to come to Spain. He then settles down in Toledo and spends the next 30 years of his life translating all of these books.
Wow.
Now, to a lot of people, that sounds like a really boring thing to do. But to people who love languages, he's in hog heaven.
Well, right. And that's in the society where we are now, where we have so much opportunity. They're in a time when the opportunities were limited, and that was quite an honor and quite a privilege to get to.
Yeah. Do you ever have a job where you think to yourself when you get up to go to the job, you think, wow, this is so much fun, and they're paying me to do it. Adalbert of Bath undoubtedly every day got up and had that same thinking. Now, he himself is not just some translator. He's also a thoughtful person, and especially when it deals with philosophy, he himself does a little bit of philosophizing too. And one of the things he wants to do is he wants to pull together Plato and Aristotle. Now, Plato is the guy he's the go-to guy during the Middle Ages. All philosophy is Neoplatonian. Aristotle now is making the big entry. And so Adalbert, right at the very beginning, takes the two and tries to deal with this. And so what he does is he comes up with the notion that both of these philosophers, although they're diametrically opposed in many ways, they both have an insight into truth. And he says he believes that Aristotle is right in arguing that the universals exist in individuals. Remember that rose nest? Okay. Now, there are those nominalists who would say that there is no such thing as rose nests. Okay. And there are others, like the philosophical realists that we talked about last time, that said, yes, roseness exists even without roses. Now, Adalbert says, well, roseness exists within the roses. That's why a rose is a rose is a rose and not a pineapple. So it does have that. But Plato is also right that the universals have their own existence outside of the individual roses. Okay, so if you take all the roses in the world and eliminate all the roses in the world, the idea of a rose still exists. And then the Aristotelian would say, oh yeah, where? And Adalbert says, in the mind of God. So it's in the mind of God that we have the abstract realities, but they're realities nonetheless. And his point is that by entering into the mind, the philosophical mind of God, by entering into that, we humans grasp that universal through our imagination.
Okay.
So again, even if we had never seen a rose in our entire life, we would have the ability through imagination to enter into the mind of God, the philosophical mind of God, where resides the concept of rose.
Okay.
So take that for what it's worth. Okay. We're going to see some other contemporaries play with these same issues, particularly one, but I'm going to hold him off until next time when we come back. And his name is Ibn Rushd. He's an Arab, and in the West, he's known as Averroes.
Oh, okay.
And you perhaps have heard his name before.
Name.
Yeah. he's going to have a lot of influence on Paris, on the University of Paris, right around the time of St. Thomas Aquinas. Now, there are other translators, too, that are making a name for themselves. And one of those is an Arab by the name of Al-Khawarizmi. Okay.
I'm glad you have to say these.
I'm probably mispronouncing it, but that's the best I can do. But he wrote a book, his translations, and this is not hard, okay? It's another Arab word, but it's not a difficult one. It's algebra.
Oh, my gosh. Okay.
And so he writes a book called Algebra, in which he describes algebra. Right? And then also writes some other works concerning Ptolemy's understandings and of the planets and of astronomy. Okay? And so he's involved in all of that. I think it's called the planetsphere or planisphere of Ptolemy. So he's involved in that. He's made quite a name for himself, so much so that the abbot of Cluny, Abbot Peter of Cluny, actually commissions him to translate the Quran into Latin.
Wow.
And up at Cluny, up at the monastery there, in the monastery library, is a Latin translation of the Quran. Because Abbot Peter felt that it was that important to know what everybody was talking about in the Arab world, and so he, as I say, he commissions Khawarizmi in order to do this. Well, added to that, there are others. In 1150, there's an Italian who becomes the archdeacon of Segovia. So he moves from Italy to Spain, and he becomes the archdeacon. His name is Dominic Gundesalvi. He also is a translator, loves translating, and his specific field. And you notice what these guys are doing is I think this helps out. Once they learn the language, whether it be Arabic or Greek or whatever, they zero in on a particular author and a particular field. Mm-hmm. And what that is, I think, is technical language. So by learning the technical words for medicine, they're able to do their translations. Mm-hmm. I remember back when I was a graduate student, we always had to take foreign languages. You had to have two other languages besides English, and so what they would do is they had classes set up specifically for those of us who were majoring in another field to take that course in that field. So when I took I took a German course, it was specifically in historical German.
Okay.
Okay. So I didn't have to worry about chemical terms. Mm-hmm, I zeroed in, and I think that maybe that's what they were doing with this too. But anyway, Deacon Dominic Gundesalvi, he zeroed in on Avicenna, who is yet another Arab of the period. He lives between 980 and 1037. His name actually is Ibn Sina, but in the West they call him Avicenna, and he wrote a book called Metaphysics. And so this is what the deacon then translates is metaphysics. And then later on, he then wrote another one called, in the Arabic, was Al-Qanon, which translates into English as the canon. Mm-hmm. That's one N, C-A-N-O-N, and it is a collection or a treatise on medicine. And so that's his area of expertise. You add to that, coming to Toledo, is another man, Gerard of Cremona. He learns Arabic in order to translate ancient Greek works that had been translated to Arabic, and he would translate them into Latin. And eventually, he translates 70 works.
Wow.
That's a bunch. And he zeroes in on Aristotle, Euclid, Archimedes, Hippocrates,
Wow.
and Galen. So these were the 5 ancient authors that he zeroes in on in order to bring that knowledge. 70 new books. You know, keep in mind that when you think about the Oxford University Library, and they only had about 40 books in their whole library, this is a tremendous addition that's being given to the overall body of knowledge. Already there was a good amount of stuff that had been translated, that had been written by Aristotle on logic. Remember, logic is very, very, very important to the medievalists, especially as they're studying that trivium. And by 1150, now there's a whole new series of works by Aristotle that are now becoming available that had not been before. In the parlance of the day, it was known as Old Logic and New Logic. And the New Logic was the hottest thing. Everybody wanted to study that. There were 4 in particular. One was entitled Analytica Priora, and then another Analytica Posteriori, and then another called Topica, and then finally another one, De Elenchis Sophisticetis.
Wow.
Whatever.
Okay.
But each one of these textbooks is a sophistication of the way in which you do logic, so that you can take a proposition and test it to see whether it's true or not. And then you take through those propositions and through syllogisms, you work this out further and further out to find whether or not there are flaws or defects in the original statement. And by doing that, you're able to do better systematic theology than they had ever been able to do before, or systematic philosophy for that part. Now, there are some translators that are good and some that are less good. And that was part of the problem, is you couldn't tell one from the other. If all you knew was Latin, then you had to rest upon the ability of the translator to give you an accurate translation. And sometimes it's better and sometimes it's not. One of those who was a superstar in all of this is a Dominican by the name of William of Moorbeck. And he was a friend of St. Thomas Aquinas. And Thomas didn't read Arabic, and I don't believe he read Greek either, but he knew enough to know that some of the books that were coming before him were not real good. And so he asked William of Moorbeck to retranslate these works, and which he did in mathematics, in physics, in astronomy. He's an incredible character. As I say, he's a friend of St. Thomas Aquinas. He's his chief translator or retranslator of these works. He himself lived at the papal court. In 1274, he was one of those summoned to the Council of Lyon as a peritos, as an expert. This is the council that St. Thomas died going to. And so, anyway, he serves at the council there. Afterwards, he was assigned to become the Bishop of Corinth in Greece. He did that for 9 years until he died. And his nickname all throughout Europe was Veritatis Amatori, the lover of truth. Yeah. He is a Renaissance man 150 years before the Renaissance. Yeah. He's one of those, William of Moorbeck is one of those that we look back to the Middle Ages and all the misconceptions and stereotypes that we have of what it means to be medieval. He blows them away. Just like those Cistercian monks blew away our misunderstandings with all of their scientific and technical advances. He's one that in translating, in understanding of mathematics, of medicine, of the arts, of philosophy, of theology, you name it, and then even Episcopal administration, he was good at everything. you know. Well, as I say, all this new logic makes it possible for speculative theology. And so the arguments are able to be carried out a little bit further than what was possible in the dialectics. So the dialectic of sic et non, you know, the yes and no of Peter Abelard, and even later with the sentences, all of that's going to begin to recede as this latest tool is being brought to the foreground. But there is a time bomb in all of these books. Somebody translates one of Aristotle's works that had been lost to the West for centuries, and it's entitled De Anima, Concerning the Soul. And it was translated by William of Venice in 1150. Now, he also was one of the translators of Aristotle's Metaphysics. But for weal or for woe, James of Venice was never considered to be a really powerful translator. Nobody really paid much attention to the stuff he translated. And so it's actually going to take another generation, another 50 years, before there's another translation of metaphysics in the early 1200s by a man by the name of Michael Scott. And then people are going to pay more attention to Aristotle's metaphysics. By 1250, there'll be translations into Latin of Aristotle's Ethics, his book called Politics, his book called Economics, and a real bestseller, Rhetoric. Okay. So what we have then is a second wave of important philosophical works, mainly by Aristotle. The first wave is going to be dealing with different kinds of logic and how to make arguments and try to figure out what is real and what is not, what is true and what is not, in a very abstract kind of a way. Now you have an application of lived philosophy, I guess you could say, especially in ethics. How do you live your life right? In politics. And I'm not talking about politics as the dirty smear campaigns, things like that. I'm talking about the polis. How do we live together as a people? Economics. How do we, it comes from that Greek term for a household. How do we live well? And then rhetoric itself. How do you get your ideas across? So that's that second wave. And then there's going to be a third wave that's going to come. And these translations are going to be books about, again, ethics and politics and philosophy. Now, this is a little quote from David Knowles, who's one of the great medieval historians. He zeroes in on the intellectual history of the Middle Ages, and he said this. He said, these treatises presented Europe with a philosopher, we're talking about Aristotle here, who regarded human life from a purely naturalistic, this world point of view. Taken as a whole, the translations of Aristotle gave Western thinkers, for the first time, matter on which to construct a full and mature system, but the atmosphere, the presuppositions of this great body of thought were not medieval and Christian, but ancient Greek and non-religious, not to say rationalistic in character. So what's happened is that the Europeans have, like a great big bass, have just swallowed the bait. Mm-hmm. You know, they swallowed Aristotle and they swallowed his good stuff. I mean, all his logic and how do you make arguments and how do you think, and then swallowed his how do we live together, how do we live a right life, an ethical life, and all of that. And so they've been just swallowing everything they have, but now they're about to get the bombshell, which is that this man that they admire so much does not believe in the immortal soul. Now, interestingly enough, there have been already 2 other civilizations that have had to deal with this. Mm-hmm. And we had no idea what they went through, and we had no idea. Well, it took a long time before we were able to even turn to them to say, what did you do with this? Mm-hmm. You know, and those are the Muslims and the Jews. Mm-hmm. You know, in fact, over the century from 1150 to 1250, the first half of that time, the first 50 years or so, was spent translating and understanding Aristotle. Once we understood him, then we turned around and we went back to the Jewish and Muslim communities and said, what do you think about this? And so we, in the West, they translated Jewish and Muslim commentaries on Aristotle in order to get up to speed on that. Now, the Muslims and the Jews they got their Aristotle lesson early on. It was about a 150-year period from around 750 to 900. And how it came to them was that as Islam spread, remember it spread north into the Holy Land and then into Syria, into present-day Iran, and eventually over into Persia. They came in contact with Christian scholars. Mm-hmm. Now, these were Greek Christian scholars, okay? And so whole cities were taken over by the Muslims, like, for instance, the city of Edessa, which was a community of Greek scholars. Now, these were Greek scholars who were not particularly enamored with Constantinople, though. Actually, they had been run out earlier on. As early as 489, the Emperor Zeno had closed down the Athenian Academy. Now, that academy had been around through thick and thin for centuries throughout the Roman Empire, going back into the time of the Greeks. And he closed that down because it was non-Christian. So all of these scholars then left, and they went to the further east where they could continue studying Aristotle and without any Christian influence. And then later, another wave of scholars, these were Christian scholars, were also sent out. And that's because they were Nestorians, okay? And so they were Nestorian scholars, and they, rather than come back to Orthodoxy, they went all the way over to Persia. And so both in Edessa and in Persia, you had two different Greek flavors. One of them was Aristotelian pagan, and the other was Nestorian Christian. Now, all of a sudden, in come the Muslims, and they convert this region, including Persia. And now they found themselves having to deal with this Greek philosophy through the eyes of Muslim faith.
Right.
Ooh, that's going to be very, very difficult. While that's happening, there's also a shift in the Arab world from the Arab control, the Umayyad dynasty. Remember, you had the first four caliphs.
Yes.
Then you had the Umayyad dynasty, which was centered basically in Damascus. And now that's going to shift. The Umayyads are going to survive in Spain, but for the most part, their dynasty is going to fall apart in the center of the Muslim world. And instead, you have the Abbasid Caliphate coming about. There's a shift now from Damascus to Baghdad and then to Persia. And Baghdad becomes very, very important in the Muslim world, especially intellectually. So now we have Syrian Christians who learn, these are scholars, learn Arabic because that's the reality they're living in, and then they translate the works of Aristotle into Arabic. And what you have then is an Islamic Renaissance in Baghdad itself. There is lots of scholars, lots of study. It's the same sort of thing that's going to happen in Europe about 300 years later is happening there in present-day Iraq, in Baghdad. And then all of a sudden, somebody translates De Anima. It seems like everyone holds that back until the last. Well, they did. And what these Muslims discovered is that Aristotle, who they have such a high regard for, tells them that human thought mainly comes through what he refers to as passive intelligence. That is to say, external stimuli enter into our senses. Now, we would today chalk that up to behavioralist psychology.
Yeah.
The Skinner kind of thing. Now, I understand that B.F. Skinner's gone away from his own teachings. But when I was in college as an undergrad taking my my psychology, I was attending a state university, and Skinnerian psychology was the thing. And so everybody looked at everybody else as a bunch of salivating dogs, or mice jumping up because of electrodes that are placed in their heads. And that's what he's basically saying, is that most of human thought actually comes to us from the outside. We just take this stuff in and we react to that. That's called passive intelligence. And then goes on to say that there is a possible active intelligence that, and I quote here David Knowles, that frames the forms that it understands. But we're not real sure, and in De Anima we're not real sure what that active intelligence is. There's one Arab, actually it's a Persian philosopher. His name is Al-Kindi. Lives about 875 A.D., and he glums onto this active intelligence idea, and he postulates that, and as I say now, most of our intelligence is passive intelligence, from what Aristotle's telling us. It's what stimulus response. But there is this active intelligence that exists, is a possibility within the human mind, and Al-Kindi says that he believes it is a superhuman intelligence that operates within the human mind. So there's something bigger than us that's operating and causing us to actually think thoughts beyond stimulus and response, and that's what pulls together our sense experiences into true human thought. I know this is kind of heavy stuff, but this is the stuff that they're dealing with, and the implications are very important for us, especially as Christians or Muslims also, as they look at anthropology as who we are as human beings. Now, it's going to take another generation for another scholar to come along, and his name is Al-Arabi, and he's going to take Al-Kindi's idea of this superhuman intelligence, and he's going to posit that as God. Now, just as easily, you could have taken, Hegelian terms and talked about it as being the world spirit, which, the Weltgeist, which is what Hegel spoke about. Our pantheists would speak about, is that there's some sort of a giant spirit that that encompasses everything. But anyway, he sees this as God, and he can see this within his Muslim faith as making sense, because God is the cause of all that exists, including intelligibility. And we have no problem with that.
Right.
He believed that the purpose or the reason for man's existence is in order to contemplate God. And this becomes part and parcel of Sufi mysticism that is that becomes so important to Islamic spirituality in the late 900s. So what we have then is an attempt on the part of these Sufi masters and on the part of these Baghdad philosophers to pull together Islamic thought on the one hand and Aristotle on the other. This is going to be a hard thing to do, and it's going to lead to a lot of problems for them. As I say, in the West, it would have been nice if we had been able to watch the progress, and so we would not have to repeat this ourselves. But what you have then is a movement within Sufi Islam of what's called the science of Tawhid. Tawhid means making one. Everything is one. And so this fits in very well with the basic stance of Islam. There is no God but God.
Right.
So it's not a plurality of gods, but there's only one God. And seen from seen from Muhammad's point of view, you would have that this God is a unity unlike everything else. One of those scholars who is able to describe this best lives around 1100, and his name is Abu Hamid al-Ghazali. And he said this, he said, "Nothing is like him, and he is not like anything." So that emphasizes that total transcendence of God. Okay? Now, as much as you have total transcendence, the Sufis are trying to move people to a total immanence with God. And how do you do that? And ultimately, they're going to turn back to an incident that happened in Muhammad's life prior to the coming of the Quran. We had mentioned this early on when we were talking about Muhammad. You might remember it. It's a very strange incident in which he had a vision of, from his point of view, it actually happened, that he was thrown to the ground, and somebody, he identifies as being the angel Gabriel, but somebody goes in and rips open his chest and removes his heart, and then polishes his heart, puts it back into the chest, purified, and then closes it up, seals it up. Now, for centuries, people have heard that legend and never really figured it out. It's the Sufis that say that this is the sign of, for all of us, that what we're to do is to open our chest, to get rid of all of our self-centeredness and all of our other worldly concerns, to take out our heart and to polish it so it's like a mirror, so that when we put it back into our body, we reflect God like a mirror reflects our face. Okay. That's pretty good stuff. You know? And so that's what Al-Ghazali is trying to tell us about that, in that relationship. Now, humans have to rely on symbols and similes and metaphors in order to come in contact with or to try to describe God. And in every case, we fail to do that. And again, there's nothing different between our Christian, our Jewish, or our Muslim insight into the total transcendence of God. There's no problem with any of that. For the Sufi spiritual leaders, they're going to see God as everything you see God. Nothing is apart from him. God is the only reality, the all. Now, some of them will carry this into pantheism. You know, others see all existence as a reflection of God. And ultimately, Al-Ghazali himself is going to reject some of this Sufi mysticism that heads toward pantheism. And what he's going to claim is this. He's going to say that God came before all and is after all. He is the prime mover, which Aristotle speaks about. From Aristotle's point of view, the whole universe got started by something or somebody. And so he calls him the prime mover. St. Thomas Aquinas will take up that same idea and call him the first cause, But Al-Ghazali is going to go beyond that and say he's more than that. God is not only the prime mover, but the move. God is the movement itself. From before anything that existed to beyond anything that ever will exist, that is the transcendent God. So to associate anything with God in any kind of a way is itself a sin. It's an ultimate sin. And therefore, polytheism is absolutely verboten because it uses images and attributes of God. And so when Muhammad went into the Kaaba and destroyed all of those statues, he was expressing the Tawhid. Then turn to Christianity. And again, Al-Ghazali is very critical of Christians, saying, look, The Trinity is an attempt to understand the Godhead. That is sinful. The notion that God could become man, like us, the incarnation, that is sinful. So he's so set on the transcendence of God that he's not able to bring himself to consider the possible immanence of God. And so anytime you have an anthropomorphized God, it's blasphemy. And look through the Old Testament and the New Testament, and we always talk of God in terms of what we understand as human beings. We call him our Father. That's not just in the New Testament. The Old Testament is full of that same attribute.
Yes.
And so you see then a real difficulty here. Now the question, of course, comes up then, okay, now if God is everything, is God evil? Because there's evil in the world too. Is he the author of evil as well as of good? Do we have free will? Or is God's Tawhid so irresistible that we have no free will? Over in the West, we find Calvin playing around with that with predestination a couple centuries later. But this becomes such an issue in the Muslim world itself that in Baghdad, they actually began an inquisition in which one question was asked. So scholars, Sufi mystics, teachers would be brought into this inquisition, and they would be asked this question: is the Quran created by God, or is it uncreated and co-eternal with God? And if you answer it right, you go home.
If you don't, you
and
don't.
If you don't, you go to jail and do not pass school. The right answer, I'm sure you want to know, is that that it was created by God. And these people, these imams, are able to go free, and they're called the rationalists.
Okay.
And the other group, called the traditionalists, argue that it is co-eternal with God, and they themselves would be tortured and thrown into prison. And this inquisition went on for several years until finally, in 861, a new caliph came in and did away with the Inquisition and did away with all the speculating. And basically, what follows afterwards, by and large, is an abandonment, with some exceptions, is an abandonment of trying to figure out a synthesis between faith and reason. So what we have instead is an expression of faith among Muslims through the 5 pillars, which is prayer, alms, fasting, the pilgrimage, the Hajj, and then also the profession of faith, which is there is no God but God. Now there will be this exception, as we'll talk about next time. Ibn Rashid, or Averroes, who lives from 1126 to 1198, he's going to continue taking a real risk by attempting to bring together faith and reason by taking Aristotle at his word. But that's the development that's going to happen in the Muslim world concerning Aristotle. So what happens then is we're sitting there, all these works are sitting in Arabic. Along come these Christian scholars, and they start picking this stuff up. And the Christian community, the intellectual community, is going to experience Aristotle the same way the Muslim community did about 150 years earlier. And it looks as though it's going to end up in the same conundrum, but it doesn't. And the reason it doesn't really is because of a handful of men who refuse to give up on the notion that there is one truth, different paths to understanding that truth, and both faith and reason help each other in order to come to that truth. And we're talking, of course, of Thomas Aquinas, of Bonaventure, of Albertus Magnus, a number of the other great luminaries of the 13th century.
That's some big work to come then.
Yes.
All right. Well, Father, shall we close today with a prayer and your blessing?
Okay. Glory be to the Father, to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit,
as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen.
May Almighty God bless you in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
Amen. Thank you, Father.
Okay.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.